Will Kane, Fox and Friends Weekend co-host. This is really disturbing stuff. I mean, the Chinese government has done everything in its power to stonewall investigations. We know that. But now we're learning that according to Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, Dr. Anthony Fauci actually could be at the center of what she calls one of the biggest cover-ups in American history.
Yep, and then I would only add to what Jim Jordan was saying there. And yet, Julie, still today, if you question Fauci's sainthood, you are a wingnut. Redfield, again, it's worth underlining and highlighting. Former director of the CDC laid out a couple of really fascinating points, Julie, that I want to reiterate. First of all, in September of 2019, that Wuhan lab changed 3 protocols that imply guilt. They deleted the strains, the codes of the virus. They changed from civilian to military oversight. And then they brought in a civilian contractor to change the ventilation system. Every one of those pieces of big circumstantial evidence pointing to their own guilt, that it was a virus created in a lab. And yet then we see the cover-up you point out. Fauci, in league with social media, of course, paints anyone who points to that truth as a conspiracy theorist. And then, again, pays off $9 million in grants to 2 scientists who said, hey, this looks like it was made in the lab. They flip. All of a sudden, they're on the same script as every other scientist out there saying it's of natural origin. Then the most fascinating question, Julie, why? And that's what Malliotakis gets to. The reason why Fauci would go to such great lengths is because of his own culpability. What he's covering up is his guilt in helping fund this worldwide pandemic. The more interesting question isn't Fauci, because that seems obvious to me, is why did the entire scientific community rally behind Fauci? And that gets us to, well, masks, lockdowns, vaccines. It's because science is lost, and it is not science. It is scientism. And it followed the Saint Fauci wherever it told them they should march. That's why the scientific community fell behind a guy who was covering up his own culpability.
The most disturbing in this is I cannot understand, I cannot grapple with the fact that the American public was not informed of this known theory years ago. It's not like it was just discovered. They've known for years. This after millions of people lost their lives. And yet still, there's a denial from the White House. There's a denial from Fauci that he ever believed that it could have potentially come from a lab. And then we hear about this $9 million, which was a grant to research, for the research doctors to go forward to that paper, which was never even forwarded to the CDC director. None of it adds up.
Oh, it adds up, though. I think it does add up, Julie. It adds up to an obvious,
it adds up to lies. That's
cover-up.
Yeah,
lies and cover-up.
Yeah, it's really disturbing, and I mean, thank God that there is this hearing right now. If it weren't for this hearing, this would have been swept under the rug. And then you have to wonder what else is being swept under the rug, if not for Republicans holding hearings to come up with answers.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'll say this, Julie. So why is this important? And it's not just retrospective. Gain-of-function research is still taking place in unsecure labs in China. To this day, gain-of-function research is part of scientific protocol. That's one. 2, as you point out, if you went to these links to cover up this story, what else did you cover up? Science doesn't, by its very nature and definition, shouldn't, and it doesn't in the popular consciousness, I think, anymore, demand blind faith.
All right.
That is not science.
Got to switch gears here now. President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from the Afghanistan front and center at a House hearing yesterday. Lawmakers looking for answers here as well. There were some really powerful stories from those on the ground during the 2 weeks of this chaos, which occurred in August of 2021. One witness, a Marine sniper who lost an arm and a leg in a suicide bombing at the Kabul airport. He gave gut-wrenching testimony about the moments following the explosion that left 13 U.S. service members dead, something he said could have been prevented.
In a flash and a massive wave of pressure, I'm thrown 12 feet onto the ground, but instantly knew what had happened. I opened my eyes to Marines dead or unconscious lying around me. A crowd of hundreds immediately vanished in front of me, and my body was catastrophically wounded with 100 to 150 ball bearings now in it. Plain and simple, we were ignored. Our expertise was disregarded. No one was held accountable for our safety.
Ignored. Can you imagine your son, your husband, fighting overseas, and you know that they could have protected themselves. That was Marine sniper Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews. Remember that name, he's a hero. He described how he and his fellow Marines indefinitely identified a suicide bomber before he killed 13 U.S. service members. He said that no one in the chain of command, Will, even knew who could give the sharpshooters the okay to take out the bomber before he got away with this grisly attack. He says, plain and simple, we were ignored. Our expertise was disregarded. This is a glaring example of how the Afghanistan pullout, ordered by our president, put our troops at grave risk.
Absolutely. He said he identified, along with other soldiers, they had a description, and he identified the suicide bomber hours before this attack took place. They had a description, they identified him, and they asked for permission to engage. And they were denied that permission. And when asked why, the answer he was given was, I don't know. And therefore, they never were allowed to engage. The suicide bomber disappears once again into the crowd hours later. What happens, as he describes right there. You know, Julie, it's just, you can listen to and talk to the soldiers on the ground almost to a man. And I've gotten to know a few of these guys who, for example, were involved in Operation Pineapple Express. Scott Mann, who testified yesterday as well. And when you see the competency, Julie, of the men on the ground, when you see the competency of the soldiers who stepped up in the void of the federal government, you see what could have been. But in alternative, in reality, unfortunately, what we had was incompetence in leadership. If you have competency on the ground, but you have a catastrophe in reality, what you have to see then is you have incompetency at leadership, driven by, I don't know, failure, fear, driven by incompetence. Who knows what it is, but it adds up to failure, and it lands squarely on leadership. It lands squarely on, you have to, the buck, as Harry Truman said with the sign on his desk, the buck stops here. The buck passes to the ultimate leader, and that is the President of the United States.
You're absolutely right.
The rocks are being lifted on the COVID cover-up. And the rot that we see underneath is what we warned you about long ago. Rank corruption at the heart of our federal response. Now, the former CDC director under Trump, Dr. Robert Redfield, was questioned about Anthony Fauci's mad scramble to conceal the role he and others played with greenlighting the funding to the Wuhan lab in China. So what did Redfield think of the paper that Fauci pressured scientists to write back in February 2020 that would conclude ultimately that COVID most likely did not escape from a lab?
This whole approach that was taken, it's antithetical to science.
Thank you.
Science has debate, and they squashed any debate.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
But wait a second. Anthony Fauci insisted under oath that the gain-of-function research, the riskiest research you can do on a virus, wasn't being done at the Wuhan lab with our help.
Dr. Fauci was affirmatively told in an email that NIAID had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through EcoHealth Alliance. He was told this in January 27th of 2020. Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
Okay, do you realize what this all means? Well, not surprisingly, Redfield told the committee that he found himself shut out of key calls early on in the pandemic. And that was when Fauci and company realized that Redfield was not going to toe the party line.
Why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
All about the science. Will these sanctimonious camera hounds who flanked Trump Day after day in the White House briefing room, these people who were pushing for these damaging lockdowns and smearing good doctors and researchers who knew the truth about inexpensive antiviral treatments, they did more than grandstand on camera, though, these people. Those people destroyed public trust in our public health officials and our entire public health system. So why weren't Fauci, his boss Francis Collins, and their useful idiot Deborah Birx at all interested in discussing what renowned experts were saying about when and how COVID spread? What explains their stunning lack of curiosity?
In September of 2019, three things happened in that lab. One is they deleted the sequences. It was highly irregular. Second thing they did was they changed the command and control of the lab from the civilian control to the military control. Highly unusual. And the third things they did, which I think is really telling, is they let a contractor redo the ventilation system in that laboratory.
There must be accountability here. There must be full transparency on the money we funneled to Wuhan. Yeah, all courtesy of you, the U.S. taxpayers. If our own public health officials had a direct or indirect involvement in the research that led to this global pandemic, Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, the entire DOJ should be ready to impanel a grand jury. There should be indictments. Oh, no, but remember, he thinks the biggest threat facing the American people are guys like that so-called QAnon shaman they threw in jail. He's the big threat. The big money in medical research from pharma and from the federal government, it has corrupted huge swaths of our scientific community, and it must stop.
The scientific community is very afraid to speak up on political issues, and I think the reason is that the government grants are handed out through this system of peer review committees, and so you don't want any single scientist on your peer review committee to vote against you. This means that they cannot be relied upon in the way that I think we would like them to be independent and forthright and call it as they see it.
For revealing how the sausage is made, by the way, that was the former medical editor of the New York Times, for how the whole scientific hierarchy cares more about their grants than the health of the American people. Nicholas Wade, you just saw there, was attacked by committee Democrats.
Inviting someone with discredited and dangerous views like Mr. Wade's to testify on the origins of this pandemic, which has disproportionately harmed communities of color, is not responsible and credible oversight.
For a race of people who have suffered, endured, and survived 3 centuries of slavery, oppression, deprivation, degradation, I'm absolutely offended that you would have the opportunity to take this platform and to add anything of significance to it.
But Mr. Wade left out another motivating factor. Well, these figures are smearing him, of course. This is just a textbook, as we've talked about so much on the Ingram angle. More than just the relationship with China that Fauci, et cetera, were protecting, as we found out back in February 2020, what was of utmost importance to Fauci? Watch.
I think early on in the outbreak, it was clear that there was some muddling of information, but over the last several weeks, the Chinese authorities have really been very explicit that they were going to not tolerate any misinformation going out.
I'm surprised that you would say that, given what we know about China's pattern of lying about critical issues, Dr. Fauci.
The Chinese scientists I've dealt with myself personally for years, if not decades. I have faith that they are not distorting things.
So China will not let any misinformation go out. He's reassuring the American public on China's behalf in that interview I did with him in February 2020. The money, the power, the fame, the media's complicity with all of this, and the dangerous and lucrative obsession that so many had in the medical community with this gain-of-function research, that was all more important to all of these people, including Fauci, than coming clean about important facts at every